My name is Jason Blanchard, and I get to introduce Alethe, and I'm going to say the entire title of her talk because I want to. Pwn Free or Die Hard, the YOLO Index and Tactical Risk and Red Team Physical Ops, what physical pen tests teach us about risk, restraint, and introducing the YOLO Index. Yeah. So if you don't know, I met Alethe many years ago. She was also part of this thing called pre-show, the 24-hour pre-show 24-hour pre-show banter con-a-thon, where we did 24 hours of pre-show banter. It was the worst thing we ever did. I still have PTSD, but at one point, Alethe came on, and she was also there with Jack Reciter from Darknet Diaries, and then the two of them just hit it off while we were there. I was just watching, which then turned into one of the best episodes of Darknet Diaries of all time. And so if you've ever had a chance to listen to that, if not, definitely check it out. Also, Alethe is one of the 9 people that we chose to be in the expansion deck of Backdoors and Breaches because of how much she gives to the community, how much she's willing to teach, and how impactful she is to our industry and cybersecurity and this community. So it is my honor to introduce Alethe, who is also a huge comic book nerd. Alethe, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for pulling yourselves out of bed this morning. I will share with you briefly that y'all are a bad influence. I barely made it here this morning, so I appreciate all of you for also getting up out of bed and joining me today. I'm trying, jeez. All right, keep the mic closer where the notes there. So if I'm yelling at you, just let me know, but here we go. So Pwn Free or Die Hard. We're, spoiler alert, gonna talk about the time that I could have been shot. All right, we're giving up on that. So as Jason mentioned, my name is Alethe. I have had some incredible opportunities that came out of that Darknet Diaries episode. One of which was I was invited to Fort Bragg, the fort formerly and soon to be known again as Fort Bragg, to train special operations personnel for our US Army on how to develop pretexts and some really cool social engineering tactics. That opportunity came out of a couple of guys listening to that episode and then contacting me on Instagram through filtered messages because they could not find my phone number or email address on the internet. So I've had some really, really neat opportunities that have come out of the podcasts and media and conferences just like this, which is why I continue to do them. Today, we're going to go through a pretty dense agenda, so I'm going to fly through it, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions. Otherwise, I will stick around at the back if you want to chat. So we're going to talk about the problem with physical red team pen testing. We're going to talk about from pwn at all costs to pwn with purpose, the 5 core principles for safer, smarter physicals, red team tales from the field, legal exposure, it's not just a letter, introducing the YOLO Index, scoring, risk, and shaping engagements, and the practical use of the YOLO Index. And then we'll talk about a summary of takeaways from all the things that I'm going to ramble at you about. So the problem with physical red teaming. What are we even testing? Let's start with the hard question. What exactly are we testing when we break into a building? Are we testing badge access, guard awareness, or are we just trophy hunting to prove that we got in? Too often, physical red teaming becomes a game of look what we did instead of an exercise in meaningful risk reduction. The red team does it differently. Some are careful and some are thoughtful. Others are just trying to rack up wins. And we're left to self-regulate. Every company handles the way that they approach physical red teaming a little bit differently, is what I've learned. And sometimes not always the best with their approach to scoping and risk reduction for consultants in the field. Some of this has to do with the incentive problem. There's a misalignment between what clients think they are buying and what red teamers want to deliver. Clients want cool stories to impress their board or their bosses. Red teamers want that adrenaline hit. And the more dramatic the breach, the better the story. You all came to my talk last year for the stories. I love telling the stories, they're great, but we really focus on that highlight reel of fun stories rather than what we're actually offering to our clients and the difference that it makes over the course of testing months, years after the test. Did we come away with a cool story, or did we actually help? This creates pressure on the red team to push limits, fudge scope, ignore nuance, and try to deliver these sensational Hollywood movie type hacks inside of our red team physical pen tests. And that's really not what's best for the organization. Real risks and real consequences exist, not only for our consultants, but for bystanders. Bystander safety is absolutely critical, and we can't risk harming, surprising, frightening, or otherwise impacting bystanders, especially in multi-tenant buildings where you have organizations that are not even in scope for the engagement. Secondly, consultants face legal exposure on a personal level. This is something that a lot of companies aren't really considering when they say, hey, you've got a job, here's some plane tickets, go out and break into this building. Sometimes our clients don't actually have the authority to give us authorization to test certain spaces. And that's not really great if we've got a couple of people on camera breaking into a place that they were never supposed to be. All it takes is a single misstep, and we can lose the client's buy-in, we can have legal exposure for the consultants, but ultimately we can risk the safety of not only bystanders, but our consultants and the employees of our client organization. Historically, red teaming has often rewarded the spectacle. If you got a picture in the CEO's office, you laying on their desk, these are all the stories that we love to hear, but the goal should not be applause. The goal is measurable improvement to the security posture. Purposeful red teaming means we design tests around the client objectives, the pain points, and the actual way an attacker could create impact on that client organization. The YOLO Index is not about being afraid to act. It's about choosing the right actions for the right reasons and documenting why we took them. There's an excellent line in Men in Black where Agent K is sitting on a bench talking to Agent J, and he essentially says that a person is smart, but people are dumb. They're panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it. And it's true. From as far back as I can remember, you know that crowds don't do well in panicking situations. They don't do well in emergency situations. And though we've listened to that little spiel on the plane every single time we get onto it, you know precisely no one is going to follow those instructions in an actual emergency. Groups respond emotionally, they mimic, and they panic. And the social proof of what everybody else is doing is going to impact the way that people behave. And usually it's unpredictably. If you're working in an environment where fear, confusion, and social proof can escalate situations fast, this is where bystander safety, being the first principle of our framework, is absolutely critical. So what are the 5 principles for smarter, safer physicals? I've hinted at some of these, but ultimately, number 1 is bystander safety. Number 2 is the safety of our consultants. 3 is consultant legal exposure at a personal or individual level. 4, company legal exposure. And finally, the alignment with our clients' goals is our 5th principle that we measure the success of the scoping of our red team physical against. Another great quote that I love is from Jurassic Park, and that is, that the scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think whether or not they should. And this is really relevant in physical pen testing because there are a lot of opportunities for us to take things to the next level, to go into the next door, to go beyond what is in scope, to go outside of those rules of engagement and to push the boundaries just to say that we could do it, we did do it, and look at all the cool things that we stole or things that we were able to accomplish that weren't necessarily a goal of the engagement. This is something that I try to politely discourage, but ultimately people have their own agency and can make their own decisions. And when you are on a team of 2 in the field, and there's no accountability from management or visibility even to managers, people can make decisions with or without their teammate that impact the safety, the legal exposure, and the impact to the project and the client goals and whether or not we're in alignment with those things. So how do we operationalize purpose? Operationalizing purpose means moving these principles out of these slides and into procedures. First, every mission plan includes a YOLO pre-score, so we know what to expect and the risk profile for each of our engagements. In multi-tenant buildings, that often means getting the landlord to also sign a letter of authorization. If a red flag appears during an operation, we have a written abort checklist and we stop. We pause and we escalate this to management to determine what we should do next and work with the client to get things back on track. There should be no debates in the field. And finally, we make the team structure such that anyone can call a timeout. The buddy system and a simple check-in cadence is something that can keep these engagements honest, and having visibility at other levels within the organization can also keep our consultants from going outside of the rules of engagement and the scope for a particular assessment. Measuring success beyond the trophy. If we want organizations to prefer purposeful testing, we have to measure the right things. A photo in the CEO's office doesn't move the needle. Fixing a control, changing a process, or changing employee behavior does. And using the YOLO Index as part of the after-action scoring, documenting near misses, and going back to do debriefs after every physical can help us do this better each time we go to scope the next physical. What our clients actually want. Most people go into physical pen testing and red teaming believing that they need to know how to pick every lock, break into every door, and basically how to be a burglar. And what I've learned through scoping these engagements is that the majority of our clients are more interested in whether or not their people can follow procedures and processes and correctly validate whether or not somebody is permitted to be in a place, in an area, and whether or not they will allow access to sensitive areas of a building over whether or not you can burglarize them. They're aware that that padlock is not secure. What they want to know is if their people are secure and if their network is secure. And honestly, about 5% of the priority in every physical red team engagement is on that element of physical bypass. So the 5 core principles of purposeful physicals are: the trophy doesn't equal success. In a lot of cases, it's the journey to the trophy. Before we jump into war stories, I want to anchor us in what these stories should teach us. And these 5 principles are how we avoid the cool over the useful. And they help us to avoid reenacting Ocean's 11 just for the win, even though I know it's fun, and looking for those trophy-seeking agendas rather than how this aligns with our client's goal for the test. So, some stories from in the field. Come out to the coast. We'll get together, have a few laughs. So, every operation always sounds like we have it planned, everything is good, the plan makes sense, and then we get out there and we realize that people are unpredictable. You really can't know how things are going to turn out once you get into the field, and trying to be prepared for how things will unfold in real time is a little rough. So when we hear this quote from Die Hard, it does kind of make me laugh, but it is so relatable because on paper, every physical red team op looks straightforward. We've got the maps, we've got the badges, we've got the plan, and then we get out there and we realize that there are security guards crawling the place for places next door who are armed with weapons that we had no idea were there. It turns out we are in like the most heavily high-end retail area of a city, and there are just cops and guards everywhere. So our whole surveillance tactical plan goes in the trash. So this is where the YOLO Index comes in to help us navigate those moments. Did you say firearms? Yes, I did. Shoot. Thank you. So the objective for this test was that we had an on-site in a multi-tenant building while trying to achieve a trophy objective of gaining access to a sensitive room in a building. Pretty straightforward. What we didn't account for was that there was a set of security guards. I'm trying to redact things in my brain as I go here, so apologize for the delays. We were able to get into the building, we were able to get upstairs, but we were not able to get into this tenant's suite using physical bypass alone. Later, when we had finished the engagement and were doing a debrief, what we found out is that this client did not read their physical security team in on the engagement. We were only working with the InfoSec team. Physical security had no idea we were there, and we had ultimately burglarized the place. We were on camera breaking into areas that our client had no authorization or authority to give us authorization to test. And thankfully for us, this physical security director decided not to escalate this to law enforcement. And he saved our bacon. So not only did we find out that we were in spaces that we should not have been trying to burglarize the joint, but we also found out later that another tenant was in charge of the guards. That tenant employed the guards, and the guards appeared to be unarmed from the outside, but our director of physical security knew that they were all concealed carry guards. So they all had weapons, you just couldn't see them. So when we asked the client at the beginning of the test, are the guards armed? They said no. And so we proceeded to test this building as if there were no armed guards. We were crawling around in dark parking structures in very early times of the morning when the only people in the building were the guards, but people were starting to show up to work. We were all over this place trying to use physical bypass tools to get into doors and to get into the suite and to override their badge access controls. And ultimately, we behaved in a way that was much more reckless than we would have if we had known that the guards were carrying weapons. Not a fun thing to learn after the fact. So in these situations, we actually have a pre-engagement checklist that we go through the client meeting with while we're doing scoping, and we try to account for all these things, but there are some things that you just can't control. Whether or not your client is going to work with their landlord, with their physical security team, read those people in and get the factual information is something that you really can't control at all. And so this one was a little bit rough. So, ho ho ho, now I have a machine gun, is kind of how that felt. This classic line from Die Hard, it's funny, but it's also a reminder that just because we've scored a win doesn't mean that we're safe. In our firearms story, we technically won. Eventually, we got in, we did the thing, we got the trophy objective, we walked up to our point of contacts while they were having breakfast in the tiny little cafe that's on their floor. But because of the scoping failures, we were sitting ducks with these guards and had no idea. And so it didn't feel like a win on the back end. It also didn't feel great to know that our client hadn't read in their physical security team and those people felt like they had been ambushed. And that is just not a great place to be in. So we try to encourage our clients to involve physical security at the top level if that's what we're going to be testing. I had another engagement where we were charged with getting a device into a conference room and implanting that behind a TV, connecting it to their conference equipment, and then exfiltrating screenshots of their sensitive meetings for the next week out over their corporate Wi-Fi. We were absolutely successful in doing this, and I've told this story a couple of times, but what I haven't shared is that another objective to this test was that we were to take OMG cables, malicious cables, and drop them on the executive desks one floor beneath the conference room. Once we completed the install of the screen crab, yes, I call it an install, we were debating whether or not we should do the second objective. I thought, we're past the external perimeter, people are gonna trust us, we look like we should be here, let's just go do it. We can just ride the elevator down, go into the next office, do the thing, complete all the objectives in one visit. My coworker was not so sure, and though we'd only been in the building about 6 minutes, they wanted to cut bait and just say, we got the objective, let's go. And so we ended up leaving, and I was a little dismayed by this because I thought sincerely we could have completed all of these objectives and that the risk for us was low. We'd already completed the first objective. The odds of them discovering that screen crab were extremely low, even if they did kick us out while we were trying to complete the second objective. And so in this case, the risk was actually very low for us if we had tried to complete the second objective, and I think that cutting bait and leaving was the wrong decision. So not as high of a risk as my coworker expected, but in the end, I decided that it was more beneficial for me to be a good teammate than to complete the objective. And so we decided to leave and try the next ones a different day. So in this case, this story, we were doing a physical, but before the physical, we had a voice phishing portion of the engagement where I was calling as an HR COO in order to get a replacement computer configured, and the goal was to get this computer put into the office of the COO, who I knew was working remotely. So I managed to change the callback phone number for the COO to my Red Team burner phone. And 15 minutes after I opened the initial ticket with Tier 1, I got a call back from Tier 2, and I was able to avoid a request for a Teams video conference call, a request for a FaceTime call on the phone to verify my identity, and also a request to have a Zoom meeting to verify my identity. This technician then said that they would go ahead and provision the laptop and then offered to help set up the profile for me on a personal computer that I had in my possession while I waited to get access to the one that was in the office. So in these cases, this engagement shows how we can set up relatively low risk situations and then stop employees prior to them doing the bad thing. I didn't actually let him set the computer up. I didn't actually let him set the user profile up on the personal computer. I felt like I'd proved my point. He wasn't going to insist on identity verification, and at this point, the only impact that I could have had on the client from this stage forward would have been negative for the person that I was impersonating. I would have taken away her access, I would have nuked the laptop that she was actually using for work that day, and I would have had a negative impact to their ability to function as a business. And that wasn't something that I felt was necessary to make the point, to generate the report, to show that they were not well equipped to defend against a social engineering attack. the point was made, and kicking people when they're down isn't really the best thing to do when you're trying to encourage people to accept your recommendations. So, a summary of our impact from the lessons in the field. The trophy does not actually equal impact to the client. Us achieving the goal is a very small part of these engagements. Cool does not mean controlled. And so being able to scope these properly, measure the risk, and approach these types of engagements with empathy enables much better red teaming. You don't want to leave the people that you are contacting or the point of contacts or ultimately the security team feeling like all you did was run in, score a touchdown, do a touchdown dance, and go home. So let's talk about legal exposure and how it is not just a letter. LOAs are only valid if the signor has the authority to authorize you to test the thing. And this is something that some individuals don't seem to recognize when they are testing multi-tenant buildings or areas where the responsibility for those spaces may be overlapping with other agencies or blurred. Essentially, if there's more than one entity that owns a space, they all need to authorize the test. And everyone at the highest level should be aware that this test is happening. Yes, unfortunately, this does mean that some organizations do cheat. But if they decide that they're going to essentially void the test, that is ultimately their decision to make, and it's out of our hands. We need to make sure that we're conducting physicals in a manner that we are protecting our consultants on the individual level and keeping them away from any legal exposure personally. We also need to protect our organizations from legal exposure. So things like scanning other tenants' badges. At what point does that become a problem? Anybody? If we scan other tenants in the multi-tenant building's badge, the point where that becomes a problem is if we try to then use company C's badge to access our client company A. So inadvertently scanning a badge, potentially a gray area, but actually putting that scan into your badge and trying to use it to pwn your client, big no-no. And things like letters of authorization to test don't actually protect you from making those mistakes or being held accountable if you leverage those things and get caught. In the movie, the villains count on law enforcement showing up because it actually helps their plan. And in Die Hard, that's the case. In our world, escalation to law enforcement is usually bad news for us. Just because we've got a letter of authorization doesn't mean it'll hold water if the wrong people get involved. So remember that only the right authority can authorize us to test. Otherwise, we are opening ourselves up to real risk. Access permissions may not belong to your client. Shared spaces and the liability that's involved there are something that we contend with a lot. So when we are scoping physical pen tests and we're in a multi-tenant building, we're very careful going through our pre-engagement checklist to make sure that we know whether or not there's property management companies, landlords, security guards, and other bystanders from other companies that could be involved in these engagements that we need to consider and ask a lot of questions. Sometimes this can be annoying to clients, but ultimately we have to make sure that even though they may not have considered this, we are doing our best to inform our clients of the risks that exist. This could be their first physical that they've ever done. It's our responsibility as testers to educate them as to the risks that exist and ask the right questions so that we can remove as much of that risk and liability as possible. In the example with the guards who were armed but concealed carry, this situation was also a multi-tenant building, and we didn't know because the client didn't know. They didn't ask enough questions. So don't be afraid to push the client to verify things and make sure that they have involved physical security and someone on the physical security team who is aware of what controls other tenants in the building may have, as well as their own, and they can help liaise with InfoSec to ensure that this engagement is scoped properly and the rules of engagement are fair for all sides. Sometimes that means limiting the testing time frame to business hours only when the external perimeter doors are unlocked. That way you don't have to burglarize the joint. Because if we're being honest, picking a lock has the same impact as running a car through the front door. We all know that locks, doors, and physical security elements are vulnerable, and sometimes testing those isn't as valuable to our clients as approaching these engagements with a social engineering pretext and actually measuring the ability that their employees have to defend against physical in-person social engineering campaigns. So let's talk about our YOLO Index. The purpose of the YOLO Index is to reduce the use of boldness connecting to recklessness. We can be bold, we can do amazing things, we can score really great touchdowns during our physicals, but we can do so without opening ourselves up to risk and the legal exposure. So what is this YOLO Index? It's a practical framework for risk-based decision-making during the scoping process as well as during an engagement. It helps our teams evaluate the trade-off of the risk versus the reward before, during, and after a physical pen test. And this helps to reduce the friction between Red Team and our clients and the folks at the top who want to see the report and read the executive summary and understand why it is that we ended up compromising a badge reader that was supposed to be secure and they spent so much money on it. So let's break down YOLO for a second. The Y stands for yield, and this is based in the value of our objective. The O for operational exposure, the likelihood of detection of our team during the physical. The L's are for legal risk to our consultant, and legal risk to our organization. And finally, our O, operational safety. And I've always said that safety is my #1 priority when we are scoping and planning a Red Team engagement. So unfortunately, when you take big risks, it may seem like a party and everything is gone amazing, but ultimately the party always ends and the chickens come home to roost, and then we have to deal with the risk, the legal exposure, and what that looks like to the outside and to the upper level folks that are in charge of measuring the success of our engagement. So why does the YOLO Index matter? This index can help us to use cleverness without getting into trouble. The structure of the index protects the consultants as well as the organization. Is this worth it? Is this not worth it? Help the client understand that a flashy move might not be worth the fallout. I can't describe how many times our clients come to us and say, our internal Red Team can't do XYZ. We're hiring you because we want you to act like the real hackers. And we have to explain how ethics work. But sometimes they want us to take risks that they don't want to take, and they just want to push that on to a vendor because they don't want to take responsibility for putting their own consultants in harm's way, and that's not something that is acceptable either. So maybe most importantly, this index helps junior Red Teamers or more cautious teammates to use a framework to say that this is something that we can't do and have something to point at that is a third-party neutral framework that can help executives and management understand why this is just too risky. And these are the reasons, and point at safety, and point at legal exposure, and point at the fact that this doesn't actually map back to our client goals for what we're trying to test. I recently had an engagement where we were signed, sealed, ready to deliver, and a couple days before the test, they go, "Do you think you guys could get access to our surveillance camera system?" And I was like, how does that help? Like, you understand how secure you are from this perspective. And I also don't think it's cool if we have access to the recordings, audio, and video of all the things that are going on inside of this building. So this is what the output will look like when we get to finishing our YOLO index. What it turns into is either low risk or high risk. And then we can help our teams understand whether or not we should move forward or if we need to go back to the drawing board on scoping. So scoring risk and shaping engagements looks a little bit like this. We have each of our 5 areas and a set of questions that we use to measure the risk in each of our areas. 1 meaning minimal risk, low concern. 5 meaning extreme risk or extreme concern and likely leading to bodily harm or at least guaranteed legal consequences. You can use a flat additive score, or you can scope these questions to suit your organization and then weight them depending on what is the most critically important element to you, your team, and your organization once you've consulted with all the legal people and the smart folks. This way you can decide, are there any non-negotiables? Is there a question that if the answer is no, you won't proceed no matter what the score is? But this is super customizable, and it's something that ultimately ends up looking like a range. So we've got easy, green, yellow, red. We have low scores, meaning we can proceed. Middle ground, we should probably pause and reassess how we're scoping this. And then red, meaning we need to stop, escalate this, and figure something else out before we either proceed with this or even put it down on a piece of paper and make a contract. We do not want to normalize proceeding in this yellowy orange territory. We really want to focus on moving forward only when we have that low risk score for our scoped physical. Ellis thinks that he's saving the day in the scene in Die Hard, but in reality, he's just digging himself in deeper. We've all had teammates or clients who sound confident but don't have the situational awareness. In the internal conflict story, that tension between pushing for the trophy and pulling back could have gone either way. Confidence alone doesn't make you right. Alignment and risk awareness do. And that's something that you want to keep in mind while you're working with your clients to prioritize the reduction of risk and then figure out how you want to weight each one of the questions that you use in your customized version of the YOLO Index. So, when do we use the index? Usually in the planning stages, when we're doing scoping, determining rules of engagement. During execution, we can also refer back to this index if things change. There are some unpredictable factors that have now, made things much different than we originally planned. And then, of course, in the debriefing, we can go back and see if our original assumptions actually mapped to the correct answers or if things turned out differently and figure out how to avoid that in the future. When things are too risky, we want to make sure that we are going and escalating these things to the folks who are doing the scoping, our managers, our sales teams, to go back and reassess how we are selling our physicals and setting the correct expectations with our clients. We don't want to wait until things are too far down the pipe and we're standing there in delivery with plane tickets going, what on earth did we get signed up to do? This is something that we want to escalate as quickly as possible and either decline to take the engagement if the client is not willing to negotiate on the scope, their goals, or what the trophy is, if it's just too darn risky, or try to coach that client gently to get us closer to green on our spectrum, reducing that risk and helping us to find an engagement where we can measure the right things, but do so in a way that prioritizes our bystander safety, our consultant safety, and all the legal risk for individuals and companies. So what does this look like from a practical perspective? Here's an example of what a YOLO Index spreadsheet could look like. In this case, you have a drop-down and data input validation in the answer column. So you pick yes or no. And essentially, the no is a 1 and the yeses are a 0 as they matter to your score. You can get more complicated on this and weight certain questions. You can take the questions and change them to suit your organization, your priorities, as they relate to the way that you deliver physical pen tests. And ultimately, once you filled out your questionnaire, it results in a net score for each of your categories and then a total score. And from that total score, we get a recommendation from the spreadsheet, which will automatically populate below your scoring in the spreadsheet to advise you on whether or not you should proceed. Something that you could do live during a scoping call with a client. This is your pre-engagement checklist. You go through the checklist with the client, answer all the questions, and then you go, this looks a little risky. Is there any way that we could reduce the risk, adjust the scope, change the rules of engagement to help make this align with your goals for testing, but also reduce the risks for safety and for legal exposure for everyone involved? And go back to the questionnaire and redo things until you get to a point where the recommendation pops up as green instead of medium risk to high risk, in which case you don't really want to draft a contract for that type of physical. So these are all completely customizable. It's something that you can discuss with management, go through and make sure that these questions align to your organizational priorities and also map really well to how you want to style and deliver your physicals. You can then, again, weight these with different weighting factors to determine a more detailed or more customized score based on the importance that you put on each one of these questions. But this is just a very simple flat scoring example that I put together for today. So, takeaways from trophy to trust, because ultimately our business is trust. And gaining the trust of our clients through these tests is critical in having them accept our recommendations coming out in the after action report and what we're advising our clients to do after the fact. So red teaming isn't about chaos, it's about calculated risk. And the scope creep is where we see these safety risks and legal concerns typically come in. Sometimes it's after that sales call. Sometimes it's during delivery when they go, hey, do you think you could hack our surveillance camera system too? So these are all things that we want to make sure that we are taking into consideration. When we're using the YOLO Index, this is really to keep us honest, aligned on all sides, and ultimately to keep everyone safe. Some frequently asked questions in the area of the YOLO Index is, isn't this inherently risky? Like, you know what you signed up for. Sure, but I think that we can really go above and beyond to make sure that we aren't putting consultants in tough situations. That's our responsibility when scoping and leading these types of engagements is not to take on unnecessary risk. What if the client insists on something risky? You don't need the money that bad. It's not a bad thing to say, we're not the company that's going to be able to help you with those particular goals. If you feel like it's going to put your consultants at risk or open your organization up to too much legal risk for it to be worth it. At the end of the day, the money doesn't really matter. It's really about delivering a quality experience and a test that actually aligns with realistic goals while keeping everybody safe. So who decides the scoring? You do. You get to adjust that spreadsheet and that questionnaire and the weighting of the questions and decide what this index looks like for your organization. It is fully customizable. And has this ever prevented a test from happening? Honestly, no. We have not ever had the YOLO Index prevent a test, but we have had it prevent us from going after certain trophies or testing during certain hours or doing certain things. And can junior consultants use this? Yes, please. I would love to see more junior consultants embrace physical red teaming from the perspective of reduction of risk and accounting and acknowledging the fact that this is reality where legal considerations and risk really do exist. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thanks for getting up early with me, and I hope you have a great rest of the con. Thank you to Wild West Hackin Fest for having me again. It was an absolute pleasure to be here.